Margaret, if we could have our Old Testament reading from Isaiah. Thank you.
The reading is taken from Isaiah 52, verse 13 to chapter 53 up to verse 12. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as they were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So will he sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a shoot out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one for whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For his transgressions of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will so to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand after the suffering of his soul. He will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a position among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong. Because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors, for he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I am Eliakim. I work metal. I've done for years. Usually on a Friday, you'd find me in my shop, smelting down the ore, forging the metal. Nails. That's my bread and butter. Nails. Nice little contract for nails with the Romans. Usually you'd find me there about this time on a Friday, making nails. But not today. Oh no. I've waited too long for this. I've lain awake too many nights, cried too many tears, and all because of you, Jesus, the Christ. He'd be about your age now, if he'd lived. But he didn't. Ironic, isn't it? We'd called him Joshua too, just like you. The Lord saves. The Lord saves. How did he save our Joshua? Where was his saving power when the soldiers came in the night, burst into our room brandishing swords and clubs, and killed him before our very eyes? He wasn't even 2 years old. It was only later I learned that Herod had ordered all the boys under 2 in our district to be killed. We lived in Bethlehem then, and Herod had been told a child who would be king had been born there, red rag to a bull. Such misery I have never seen. They say the blood ran red in the streets for that boy. They say the screams of the mothers could be heard the other side of the Jordan. I vowed that night I would see that child die. My wife never recovered from the shock. And since that day, over 30 years ago, my whole life has been eaten up with bitterness towards the child born to be king. So finally, here we are, face to face. I watched the soldiers hammer the nails, my nails, into his left hand, and I cried out, "That's for my son." And when the nail, my nail, went through his right hand, I cried, "That's for my wife." It's strange. I thought I'd gloat. I thought I'd feel some great surge of satisfaction. But when he heard my cry, he raised his head. It was the first time I'd really looked at his face. He didn't look like I expected. I thought he'd be proud, self-satisfied, smug even. Most kings are, oblivious to the suffering they've inflicted, cushioned from how they make their people suffer. But he wasn't. There was more suffering etched on his face than you can imagine. Not just his own suffering. God knows that was bad enough. No, somehow he seemed to be carrying the suffering of the world. My suffering. I looked at the nails. I thought of how I'd worked them in the forge, red hot, white hot, and suddenly I felt the same heat, red hot, white hot. It surged through my breast, and all the bitterness of the years was burned away in one unbelievable moment. I closed my eyes and gasped. The power of the moment had taken me by surprise. I did not think it possible to forgive and be forgiven in the same instant. But that's what had happened. When I opened my eyes, he was dead. Roger, could we have our New Testament reading? Thank you.
The New Testament reading is from Matthew, chapter 27, verses 26 to 50. Pilate set Barabbas free. Then he ordered his soldiers to beat Jesus with a whip and to nail him to a cross. The governor's soldiers led Jesus into the fortress and brought together the rest of the troops, which in real terms probably meant between 200 and 600 soldiers. They stripped off Jesus' clothes and put a scarlet robe on him. They made a crown out of thorn branches and placed it on his head. And they put a stick in his right hand. The soldiers knelt down and pretended to worship him. They made fun of him and shouted, "Hey, hey, you King of the Jews!" Then they spat on him. They took the stick from him and beat him on the head with it. When the soldiers had finished making fun of Jesus, they took off the robe. They put his own clothes back on him and led him off to be nailed to a cross. On the way, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry Jesus' cross. They came to a place named Golgotha, which means place of a skull. There they gave Jesus some wine mixed with a drug to ease the pain. But when Jesus tasted what it was, he refused to drink it. The soldiers nailed Jesus to a cross and then gambled to see who would get his clothes. Then they sat down to guard him. And above his head they put a sign that told why he was nailed there. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." The soldiers also nailed 2 criminals on crosses, one to the right of Jesus and the other to his left. People who passed by said terrible things about Jesus. They shook their heads and shouted, so you're the one who claimed you could tear down the temple and build it again in 3 days? Well, if you are God's son, go and save yourself and come down from the cross. The chief priests, the leaders, and the teachers of the law of Moses also made fun of Jesus. They said, "Oh, yes, he saved others, but he can't save himself. If he is the King of Israel, he should come down from the cross. Then we will believe him." He trusted God, so let God save him if he wants to. He even said he was God's son. The 2 criminals also joined in and said cruel things to Jesus. At midday, the sky turned dark and stayed that way until 3 o'clock. Then about that time, Jesus shouted, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you deserted me?" Some of the people standing there heard Jesus and said, "He's calling for Elijah." And one of them at once ran and grabbed a sponge. He soaked it in the wine and then put it on a stick and held it up to Jesus. Others said, "Oh, wait, let's see if Elijah will come and save him." Once again, Jesus shouted, and then he died.
Lord Jesus, your sign of reconciliation is the cross, in all its breadth and length and height and depth. Teach us to share it with you and with our sisters and brothers, so that we may learn to act justly, walk humbly, and love tenderly, and so waiting upon the Spirit to become instruments of your peace, to the glory of God the Father. Amen. Apparently there's a novel out called England, England, in which the author, Julian Barnes, imagines the Isle of Wight being turned into a miniature version of the whole of England, with all the familiar landmarks rebuilt there and all the familiar events restaged. So your busy foreign tourist doesn't need to tour England, nor even visit London in order to do England. Everything's there on the Isle of Wight. In the middle, of course, Barnes imagines a role for the monarchy, because that's what intrigued so many foreign visitors. So there's a king and a queen, paid live in a replica palace. They emerge onto the balcony at regular times to give a royal wave to the crowd. Royal events are staged so that tourists feel they've seen the real thing. But of course, it's all make-believe. Everyone would know it's just a great theme park. The motive behind it all is, of course, simply money. But the motive for the faked royal events we've just heard about in Matthew chapter 27 is more complex. The soldiers mocking Jesus as a king had nothing to gain financially by dressing him in a robe, saluting him, and kneeling down before him. There were other things on their minds. They had been fighting what we now call terrorists, Jewish rebels against Rome, desperate for liberty, ready to do anything. Maybe the soldiers had seen their own colleagues killed. They were tired of policing such a place, far from homes, having to keep a lid on a volatile situation with many rebel groups ready to riot. And now they're offered someone who has claimed to be king of the Jews. He's due to die within a few hours. Why not have a bit of fun at his expense? Why not tease him, beat him up a bit, show him what Romans think of alternative kings? Like the king in Julian Barnes's small-scale England, let's remind Jesus that in fact someone else is boss. Let us not forget that Jesus is the same one who, days before, was confronting the temple authorities, who weeks before was healing people, celebrating with people, and teaching people about God's kingdom. The crucifixion is not a messy end to Jesus' glittering career. No, it was, although shocking, the proper climax to it. Pilate and his soldiers saw Jesus' claim to be a king, to be Israel's true king, as his crime. We see it as the truth. And that kingdom would be established by his crucifixion. But isn't it a natural human reaction when we see people suffer to ask the God of love, why? And we picture the Jesus we love dying on that cross. We ask the God of love, why? Why? Because the kingdom Jesus had spoken of from the Sermon on the Mount onwards was never a kingdom to be established or maintained by military force. If this were to be God's kingdom, it would come about by God's means. And the means that the true God chooses to use are the means of self-giving love. If any of you has a Bible in front of you, you may wish to check back to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, on which I preached last October, because then, and still today, we are in Matthew's Gospel. The Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 records what Jesus said. And now Matthew 27 records what Jesus did. So in chapter 5, verse 39, Jesus said, "Do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." Now, Jesus is struck about the face by soldiers, and he does not retaliate. In chapter 5, verse 40, Jesus said, "And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well." Now he has both his outer and inner garments removed by the soldiers. In chapter 5, verse 41, he said, "And if one of the occupation troops forces you to carry his pack 1 kilometer, carry it 2 kilometers." Now, as he's going out to be crucified, the soldiers use their Roman legal right to compel someone to carry a burden for them. Only this time, the burden is a heavy crossbeam, the one on which Jesus will be hung. And in chapter 5, verse 14, Jesus said, "A city on a hill cannot be hidden." Next, he himself will be set on a hill called Golgotha, unable to remain hidden. My point is that Jesus is leading the way he had spoken of from the beginning, the way of being the light of the world. This will be how he is shining the light of God's love into the dark corners of this world, by taking the evil of this world, the cruelty, the hatred, and the unthinking mockery of this world, the gratuitous violence, the bullying and torture that still defaces our world, and letting it do its worst to him. Never let them tell you that the Christian faith is an airy-fairy thing, all about enjoying wonderful inner spiritual experiences, and not about the real world we live and work in. The crucifixion takes us to the heart of Christianity, and here we meet, close up and raw, the anger and bitterness of the world, doing its worst against the one who embodies the love of the Creator God himself. I conclude with 3 responses that we may make as we watch this shocking, tragic, and yet deeply healing event take place on the cross before us. And each of those 3 responses is somehow deeper than the one before it. For first, we may be outraged that such things should happen. And Jesus says, yes, and they're still happening to people around the world today. And what are we, his followers, doing about it? Or second, we may be the more horrified that such things should happen to Jesus, who has done so many wonderful things, through whom healing and restoration, forgiveness and love come freely to so many. And Jesus says, yes, and I shall yet bring healing, forgiveness, and hope to many, to millions more. Have you yourself experienced that healing? Have you received that forgiveness? And do you live in that hope? And if you do know this healing and forgiveness for yourself, Jesus asks whether you are helping others to know it as well. Which is why the 4 local churches, 2 in Groby, 2 in Ratby, are holding a taster session for the Alpha course here on Monday week, the 8th of April, from 7 o'clock, with dinner provided. If you would like to know more of this healing and forgiveness that Jesus offers, or know someone else who would be willing, why not put the name for this one-off session, and, if it helps, join our next full-length Alpha course when we hold one. But thirdly and finally, we may be simply overwhelmed when we realize that all this was done for us. For me personally, the absolute most startling and amazing aspect of the whole gospel is that Jesus would have gone through all that even if it had been only for me. He would have suffered, been mocked and tortured and died, even if you had been the only other person on earth. You, or you, or you. We sang earlier, crucified, you lived to die, rejected and alone, like a rose trampled on the ground, you took the fall and thought of me above all. Are we truly grateful? It's our top priority in our busy lives to worship and adore this Jesus, in whose death we see the face of God turned towards us in love. If so, then we are summoned to follow him on the same path, the way he described so vividly in the Beatitudes and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, the way he now goes himself, the way of the self-sacrificial love, the way that took him to the cross. Amen. How deep the Father's love for us. We stand to sing. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mother chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gift, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my